Right, this is Year 1 Psychology, this is AQA, and this is looking at attachment and Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory. So in this video we're going to look at what was the theory of maternal deprivation, and we're also going to look at what research has been done and also evaluate. So first of all, let's have a look at what we mean by maternal deprivation. Now, this is all about where you have an attachment and then it's disrupted. What happens? What's the effect on the child if the bond is disrupted in some way? And there's two ways that can happen. The first is through what we call relatively short-term separations from the primary caregiver. So, for example, if the child is dropped off at nursery for the day, that's the sort of thing we mean by separation. If what we're talking about in this video is what's called maternal deprivation, and that really is what we're talking about when you have a much longer term separation. So in the past, when quite a lot of this research was done, there would be, for example, when mum went into hospital for that might be for a few weeks, because people used to stay in hospital longer. So that would be more what we're talking about, or equally obviously if the parent dies. So we're talking about, for maternal deprivation, what happens when a bond has been formed and then it is broken for a long period of time. So here we go. Here's the definition. Prolonged deprivation of a young child of maternal care may have grave and far-reaching effects on his character. And Bowlby said it was similar in form to deprivation of vitamins in infancy, saying that actually the effect of having a maternal deprivation happening to you can be as bad as physically not being given the right vitamins, because of the effects that it will have on you. So let's have a look at a bit more detail about this theory. That's the hypothesis. Deprivation basically is prolonged separation between a child and its caregiver, causing loss of an attachment. And here are some of the effects that it can have on some of the following slides. First of all, though, Bowlby's really looking at what's called the critical period. You'll remember this from when we looked at Bowlby's theory of attachment, that he thinks that we have a critical period up to 2.5 years where you should have that unbroken attachment bond with one main caregiver, monotropy, remember. And he's really looking at when this maternal deprivation happens within that critical period. So let's look at some of the effects. Deprivation can cause intellectual development to be stunted. So things like a lower IQ might be found in children who've experienced maternal deprivation. Evidence for this comes from Goldfarb, and he was actually looking at children who were in an orphanage. And he compared children who'd maybe been in the orphanage for a few months and then they were fostered by a family. He compared those kinds of children with children who were maybe in the orphanage for 3 years. And what he found was, if he compared those two groups of children, he found lower IQs in the children who had stayed in the orphanage compared to those who'd been fostered. So that suggested to him that if maternal deprivation occurs, that can really stunt intellectual development. And again, this is a look at deprivation where a bond has been formed first and then broken, not to be confused with the other topic that we'll do next, which is institutionalization, where often a bond hasn't formed at all. So that particular study is looking at deprivation. And then what we have next is emotional development can be affected as well if maternal deprivation occurs. So the thing that Bowlby really looked at was psychopathy. And you may you will have heard of you'll have heard of a psychopath, or you might be hazy on what one is. If you're a psychopath, that's basically a personality disorder. Psychopathy, a personality disorder where you show no empathy or remorse for your actions. You might show antisocial behaviour. You might be a bit selfish and egotistical, and so on. And some famous examples of that are these three who you may have heard of: Adolf Eichmann, Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Mengele, for those of you who know a bit about the Holocaust, they're basically the three architects of the Holocaust who did absolutely horrific things in the Second World War, and they are all psychopaths. And many murderers are psychopaths because if you're unable to experience guilt or strong emotions connected with your actions, then actually you often end up being a criminal, because if you don't feel any remorse, like, that's a big deterrent removed, isn't it? You can't empathise with your victims at all. It makes you much more likely to go down a more criminal route of behaviour. So affectionless just means without emotion. So affectionless psychopathy, the inability to experience guilt or strong emotions for others. So Bowlby said that deprivation could lead to this. Okay, and that finding really comes from this key study, which you need to know about, called the 44 Thieves study that Bowlby conducted. And I'm going to tell you this with with a bit of a visual, because it is a little bit like a numbers game, this study. But so let's see. Let's just go through it. So you've got, first of all, he looked at 44 thieves. These were children that had been referred to a child protection programme in London for stealing. And he then found a control group who had also been referred to the clinic, but they weren't criminal, but they were emotionally disturbed. So they hadn't been stealing, but they'd been referred to the clinic because they were emotionally disturbed in some way. So he's comparing these two groups in terms of their behaviour. And what he found was that in the 44 Thieves group, he classed 14 of them as affectionless psychopaths. And then if we look at the who had experienced maternal deprivation, so none of the none of the control group were affectionless psychopaths. And then in the thieves group, if we look just at the affectionless psychopaths, 12 of them had experienced maternal deprivation, 12 out of 14, which is a very high proportion. If we compare that to the rest of the thieves, who weren't affectionless psychopaths but were showing criminal behaviour, 5 of those had experienced maternal deprivation. And then if we compare that to the control group, only 2 out of the whole control group had actually experienced maternal deprivation. So you can see there, it's quite compelling figures, isn't it? You can see that, particularly looking at those who were affectionless psychopaths, and 12 out of 14 of them had experienced maternal deprivation. That's quite staggering compared to, if you compare that figure to the control group. So if I were you, before we carry on, I would pause the video here and make some notes about that, making sure that you have straight in your head which figure refers to what and which group is which, and so on. Okay, let's have a look at evaluating the study. So if you are outlining and evaluating that particular study, what you could talk about is, well, this is the main flaw in the study, is the fact that that Bowlby was the one who carried out all the interviews and assessments to work out who was an affectionless psychopath and who wasn't. He obviously knew what he was hoping to find, or he'd made his hypothesis. He was thinking, that people with maternal deprivation would be damaged in some way, and so he was expecting to find something of this nature, probably. So we could talk about the fact that researcher bias may be affecting the outcome. If you're interviewing people and if they're in the thieves group, you're interviewing maybe their family to find out what kind of separations they had as a child. Maybe you dig a little bit deeper, not necessarily consciously, but the investigator may often, even unconsciously, in various ways affect the outcome. And it would have been better, obviously, for him to carry out more like a blind test, where someone's interviewing and making the judgment who doesn't know if they're looking at a thief or a non-thief, so that it's not possible for that to affect their judgment. The other thing linked to that is just subjectivity, where how do you make that judgment about whether someone is an affectionate psychopath or not? That has to be really objective, but it's hard to make that like objective fact. Like, at what point? Because everyone's going to be on a scale somewhere. We don't want it to be just Bowlby's personal opinion. We want it to be like objective fact, don't we? So you could talk about that. You could obviously also talk about the fact that what we're looking at here is not it's not a proper experiment, because they're not able to allocate the participants randomly into different groups. They're just having to exploit something that's happened already. So it's more like a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment. So we can't make we can't randomly allocate the participants, so there may be other factors that are also affecting it that we're not aware of. Okay, theory. So that was if you're evaluating the study. If you're describing the theory of maternal deprivation and needing to evaluate that, these are the points that we could make. So first of all, Bowlby came up with this theory having looked at lots of real life cases of maternal deprivation. So while we could quibble about his study, actually he's come up with this theory it's not based on like some random lab experiment. It's based on real life. So we could argue it's got quite good external validity because he's been looking at it in real life. It is supported by research. Those figures in the 44 Thieves study are hard to argue with. Other research, though, has contradicted it. So this would be where we're going into weaknesses. Other research has contradicted it. So Lewis actually replicated the study and found that early prolonged separation from the mother did not predict criminality. And this was looking at, it was a larger scale study as well, looking at 500 young people. So you could almost argue, like, was Bowlby's finding just chance because he had a smaller sample? More research needs to be carried out on this. The other criticism you could make is that actually the idea of this maternal deprivation during a critical period, you could question it, because some people have actually been shown to recover from deprivation. There's quite a famous case study carried out on Czech twins who were reported on by Kolachova, they'd had a bond with their parents up until the age of 18 months, and then from that point until they were 7, they were locked away, so they'd had that bond was broken, and they were really damaged when they were first discovered at the age of 7. However, they did then go on to recover and live a relatively normal life once they'd been discovered and looked after for a while. So that suggests that perhaps we could say, rather than like it being a critical period and the bond has to remain unbroken through this whole time, or else we could maybe have it a bit more grey and it's like a sensitive period. So for most people within this time, if the bond is broken, it can have effects. So just perhaps being a little bit less strict with the theory, if that makes sense. Right, so that is the end of my the information that I'm going to give you. I'll give you instructions as I send this out about what you need to do to go over that.